Hi, I'm Mo,
I'm Erin.
and this is Couch Astrology.
Today we're going to be talking about Mercury, which I am super excited about. Now we have moved out of the big three. So sun, moon, and rising we talked about, and now we're getting to move into, I guess not necessarily the outer planets, but planets that are further out.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Um, and so Mercury actually is a fast moving planet. So it is the planet that moves the quickest outside of the moon, which is technically a luminary.
Right.
But the moon changes signs every 2.5 days, and then Mercury would follow it in speed by changing at about 14 to 30 days. Mercury changes signs, which is really fast
Yeah.
compared to other signs or compared to other planets. So, another fun fact about Mercury is, or about your placement in Mercury, is that the sign it falls in will always be a sign away from your sun sign, or it will fall into the same sign. So, for example, my sun's in Leo, so my Mercury options are going to be Leo, Virgo, or Cancer.
Right.
So,
And it's really common also for people to have their Mercury in the same sun sign for that reason because they're
yeah,
so close to each other.
yeah. So I think people see that often and maybe don't realize it. I know when I saw it, I was like, oh, I just thought that it, you know,
Just happen to be
just happened to be that way, and
that
it did just happen to be that
Yeah.
way. But also, it doesn't go far
You
out.
don't have all 12 options.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, you're going to stay close when it comes to that. So, um, yeah, I'm excited. We know Mercury to mean like a few things just right off the bat. I think most people think of Mercury, they think of how we think, communicate,
Mm-hmm.
um, maybe like process information. And all of those things are very true to Mercury. But learning more about Mercury helped me really understand like the other planets in my chart too, and how they communicate with each other more than just how I communicate with the outside world. Like my thoughts about Mercury for so long were, how do I show up in conversation with
Yeah.
someone,
Mm-hmm.
or like
Think
how do I
about things in my head,
yeah, how
maybe.
do I
Yeah.
think about things in my head? And then I don't know, it's just like left me with not so much to think about,
One note.
and all of it was so true, but it Mercury is so much more. Like it really becomes a filter to everything that we experience in our chart. So it'll be fun to kind of explore that together and what it
Especially with
means.
other planets. Yeah.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
exactly. So, do you want to talk about rulership?
Yeah. So Mercury is ruled by Virgo and Gemini. Virgo obviously being the Earth Mercurian, and Gemini is the air Mercurian. Um, Also, Mercury is the only planet that has a sign that rules it also exalted. So
Mm-hmm.
Virgo is exalted in Mercury, and it rules Mercury.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then we have Pisces and Sagittarius in detriment, and Pisces also in fall. So there's another double right there, the opposite of Virgo. Um, yeah.
Yeah, and I like with the rulership too. Like when I think of Virgo and I think of Gemini, that is so mercurial to
Yeah.
me. But I think of them in completely, I mean, I wouldn't even set Gemini and Virgo next to each other
No, it's
naturally,
so
but
weird.
Virgo to me is like the thinker,
Mm-hmm.
and Gemini is the talker,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
but also obviously personally when I think about Virgo, I think about writing. That's what I think about. It's such a
Mm-hmm.
common theme um, for Virgos to be like the writers.
Mm-hmm.
But so you see like the kind of, and we'll get into that a little bit more. But hi baby. But but yeah, there's two completely different energies who both rule
Mm-hmm.
in um, Mercury, but kind of have different goals.
Right.
Yeah.
And what's interesting too, is that we have Virgo, the earth sign, and Gemini, the air sign. And those are, you know, at home and Mercury and feeling really
Mm-hmm.
good. Um, it being earth and air makes sense because earth has that sort of grounded and realism and
Like the
the
structure to it.
information and
Yeah.
the facts to it. Whereas Gemini with the air has sort of the communication, the connection, relating. Um, and when you look at the signs that are in detriment, Sag and Pisces, um, it makes sense why they wouldn't be super comfortable in Mercury because maybe they're leading with more emotion and they're more zoomed out. Like we kind of touched on that as well about how they're.
Yeah, like if Jupiter, like talking about the differences between Jupiter and Mercury would
Mm-hmm.
be like a good point to draw in,
Mm-hmm.
is that Jupiter is focused on like the big picture,
Mm-hmm.
and Mercury is focused on the small details.
Mm-hmm.
So Virgo, especially, and being like the ruler and the one, being exalted, is very like detail oriented,
Mm-hmm.
and so it fits really nicely into Mercury, who wants to have all of those things put together, like all the parts put together.
Right.
Um, but then you look at Sag and Pisces, who rule Jupiter
Mm-hmm.
and are all about expansion
Mm-hmm.
and this like big idea. And
Zooming out.
yeah, and like the same way that Virgo and Gemini kind of have different functions to Mercury,
Mm-hmm.
Pisces and Sagittarius, I mean,
Yeah, I couldn't.
couldn't be more
Yeah.
different, but they really like, I would say Pisces is more internal, Sag is more external, and they are not really going to get the job done when it comes to what Mercury is calling us to,
Mm-hmm.
which
Mm-hmm.
is to like be in the details,
Mm-hmm.
take it apart, put it back together, that
Mm-hmm.
whole idea. They are just going to say, I have this amazing idea, that like big optimism. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I have this big idea, and obviously Pisces can get into like disillusionment, and
Mm-hmm.
Sagittarius can be kind of scattered, but they have this sense of optimism that feels really spiritual. And
Mm-hmm.
Mercury's not
Not worried about
spiritual; it's
that.
worried about the facts. And
Yeah.
so, but there's this essence to Sagittarius and Pisces in that way, where they're almost can be ruled by the heart. You
Right.
know,
Yeah.
is like pushed by that kind of, I don't know, that gut feeling that we get, that like internal instinct, whereas Mercury tries to like almost talk us into reasoning.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And even separating the two with Sag and Pisces, where I would say with Mercury, um, not necessarily trying to like stand out or confront anything.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you think about even Gemini being the sort of chameleon, and Sag is jumping right out at you. That's not necessarily Mercury's vibe. And with Pisces and Virgo, Virgo's thinking, what's rational, what makes sense. When I put the facts together, and Pisces is just leading emotionally.
Jesus. Right in your face. Sorry.
Moving on. Okay. Um, collect.
But yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Okay, so I do want to go into some of like the, I guess, keywords, key
Mm-hmm.
ideas for,
Indications.
yeah,
Yeah.
for Mercury. So we talked about like the mind, intellect, powers of communication, ability to communicate their thoughts,
Mm-hmm.
right? And this can be especially focused on like the whole placement, so like factoring in the house as well, because
Mm-hmm.
that can also have some, play a role in maybe our ability
Mm-hmm.
to function in
Or
Mercury.
where you're doing that sort of
Right, but it
communication and
also,
thinking.
yeah, but it also like builds to like the strength of that power,
Totally.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And ideas that we have, um, cognition, integration, interaction. So how can I show up? What are my thoughts about the world?
Mm-hmm.
I like that integration. That feels good to me.
Mm-hmm.
Like the, how can I, how do I usually show up and become a part, you
Mm-hmm.
know?
And makes sense. Like, where do I fit in
Yeah,
almost?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. Um, and then some of Valen's, I would like to just like walk through some of Valen's
Yeah.
significations. Um, so yeah, I mean, you can read them. We can talk about them
So
more.
we have and I mean, they're kind of similar, but this is where it's more fun because I feel like this is where we start getting to the personality
Yeah.
of Mercury. But we have education, writings, and interactions with symbols in general, disputes, brotherhood, youth, play, theft, community, whimsy, mischievy. Am I saying that right?
Mhm.
Mischievy, service, sending messages, following, suspense, versatility, calculations, and the bestower of critical thinking and judgment.
Yeah. So many are so
Yeah.
good. I'm I'm looking through too. I like the obviously versatility, but I like calculations because one, Mercury it signifies like math in
Mhm.
general,
Mhm.
like solving problems.
Mhm.
But there's also the idea of like calculation when it comes to like interaction with
And your next
people.
steps
Yes.
kind of
Yeah, like being calculated.
mhm. Mhm.
Um,
Which isn't always like a negative.
yeah, it's not always
Yeah.
positive,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know,
It
like,
just is, yeah.
yeah, and that's the thing about Mercury is Mercury is going to break all of that down for us and kind of
Right.
give us some information as to how we calculate, you know,
Mhm.
like how we go about finding those answers. Mercury is the bestower of critical thinking. Yes, Mercury is the critical thinker.
Right.
You know, it is judgment, right?
Mhm.
Because the same way that it's how we break a problem apart and put it back together, like this is also how we break a person apart. Do you know what
Mhm.
I mean? And I
Mhm.
don't mean physically, obviously,
Yeah.
but I just mean that judgment, you
Yeah.
know, is like I am looking at you and I'm seeing it really for like I hate to say what it is, but like just things,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Like it's information almost.
Itemizing,
Yeah.
sort of just like in a list format almost of just, and
Yes.
that's what I think of what the judgments part is. Sort of, okay, well, once you have this information, how are you going to figure out how you want to put it together and how to organize it efficiently? Like you're going to, judge it based off of what makes sense to
Yeah.
put what together. How are
Yeah.
you going to build those blocks together?
Yeah.
um
Absolutely.
yeah.
Um, same thing with like dispute. And I liked what you had said when we were talking earlier about um, like how Mars comes in and plays a part as to like the energy that pushes some of these things forward.
Hmm.
Like
The
Mercury,
action.
yeah, like Mercury is the filter for how maybe it comes out, whereas Mars and arguably sometimes like your ascendant too would be kind of this like energy that pushes it
Hmm.
forward.
Hmm.
And this is kind of like one of those, you know, thoughts that we're starting that can tie in every single planet.
Right,
But like
totally.
talking about the moon too is like our intention, right? Like,
Mm,
well, what is my intention? But Mercury just is like straight facts,
yeah.
you know, and so that is always when it comes down to it, Mercury is going to filter through that
Hmm.
lens.
Hmm. And
Um,
then use it to connect or relate or
yes,
right.
exactly. And I like too what it said what we were listening to earlier, where they talked about like Mercury can also fall on when it falls on its negative side,
Hmm.
right? Which it does, like every planet does.
Totally,
Yeah,
totally.
like we experience all parts of life. And so Mercury also can fall into like rationalization is a great word for
Yeah.
Mercury and how, you know, we talked about Sagittarius and Pisces and just using really them as an example, but there's so many examples that can be applied here is like when I have that feeling that maybe is less logical, like that gut feeling, or I'm like feeling like my heart is speaking to me, and but there's no logic behind it, right? It's just a feeling or a thought or an intuition, whatever it is. Mercury can over rationalize it.
Right.
And that is like the common mercurial human
Mhm.
experience is like,
Mhm.
okay, well, I'm feeling this way, and it really feels like I'm being pulled by this feeling or whatever it is. Like my gut is really trying to tell me something, but my mind will
Is thinking me out of it.
think me out of it.
Yeah.
Yes. And that is where we can fall into like maybe a negative side of
Right.
Mercury. Is when we over rationalize,
Right.
you know, and rationalization can also be an extremely helpful tool, you
Totally.
know, like talking myself off the ledge is
Right.
like bringing myself back down to earth is that when I get too caught up in maybe like what turns into like emotionalism, then I can rationalize and say like, okay, the world is not
Let's pump the
ending.
brakes.
Yeah.
Pump the brakes. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And that's what I think is interesting too about the whole rationalization thing is that I feel like, Mercury's kind of with the extremes, you can think or almost talk your way out of anything really. So it's like
Mm,
there does have to be a sort of like, maybe like a limit isn't the right word, but a sort of like reining in and balance as there is with every other planet or energy of like how far are we going to go in these spirals in our heads to like put two and two together at a certain point, you
yeah.
know. um
Yeah. It's where we have to like learn to let the planets balance themselves,
yep.
you know, is like like we talked about honoring our moon, we've talked about all of those things where it's like, okay, how do I honor all of these different parts of myself at once, but let Mercury do its job,
Yeah.
Like my Mercury is there because it serves a purpose, but that purpose can run to an extreme
Mhm.
sometimes. And if I
Mhm.
don't kind of put the reins on it, then I'm going to think that I have all of the answers
Mhm.
by talking from a point of logic when we know that the human experience is
Is
far
not
beyond
based.
that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Um,
Totally.
love
Um,
that.
I'm excited. I don't know why I get excited with the gods, but the Roman god Mercurius, gotta mention him, the god of speed and commerce. He's often serving as a mediator between the gods and mortals, his winged feet giving him the advantage of speed, and so was the patron of circulation in general, of people, goods, and messages. So I feel like some of the Valen significations, even the whimsy, the theft, the play, the mischievy, that's where it's fun to start thinking about the Roman god of Mercurius, because that's um, I don't know. I feel like it gives a little bit of a different side, as we were just saying earlier, when we started, about how, okay, Mercury is the intellect and it's the communication, it's the thinking, and especially when you think about rulership in Virgo, it makes sense, and it makes sense for like when you think about Gemini as well. But especially as we get into Gemini, Gemini is like has that playful, has that sort of mischievous side, and
Yeah, so
the
true.
wits and stuff. And I think when you think about Mercurius, it starts to kind of paint a whole picture together of a personality of the planet.
Yeah, I do often like to give like a personality. And this always does a good job of it. But yeah, I mean, this is the it, the patron of circulation in general, right? People, goods, messages, like that is what Mercury represents,
Mhm. Mhm.
and then the speed at which it happens.
Mhm.
Now, Mercury is not. Mercury as a planet is fast moving,
Mhm.
right? But oftentimes our maybe like experience of Mercury in our chart does not always feel so fast, you
Totally.
know. But
Totally.
there are obviously so many things going at one
Mhm.
time. Um, so yeah, I do like that. I think that's fun.
Yeah. And to add on to that, I had some other just fun facts, I guess, because I was thinking about how Mercury is, it feels like the sort of trickster. And I think we've heard that come up a couple of times as we were diving into Mercury. And so I had to know like what tarot card was associated with Mercury, and it's the Magician, which is fun, and it starts to melt together as well when you think of the Magician. And they're quick, they're skilled, they have a sort of deception, but there's like an entertainment value to it, whimsical, and there's even some symbolism there with the Magician of kind of like peek behind the curtain, and you know there might be more
More than what you
going on.
can see.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. And we talked about like the what part of the body Mercury
Yes.
rules,
Yeah.
and is the hands and the shoulders.
Right.
And I'm like watching you talk about it and use your hands. And then we think about the magician who
Yeah.
often uses their hands
Totally.
to like display whatever it is, whatever trick they're trying to.
Yeah. And even the hands alone, when you think about how we use them to express ourselves
Mhm.
and to communicate, to count, to interact, to touch, and
Yeah.
um, give off certain messages. I mean, it's just, yeah, it's
Well, and
cool.
we talked about like Mercury also signifying like service, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like I use my hands often to be of service,
Yeah.
you know, and to
That's where that
give.
labor part comes
Yeah, like we
in.
think of giving and taking, and we think
Mm-hmm.
of the hands, and we think of play, and we think
Mm-hmm.
of the
And
hands, and
building, and
yeah,
yeah.
it's really the hands is such a huge thread through all of the significations that we read.
Yeah.
Like you talked about calculations, like counting with the fingers. We talk
Mm-hmm.
about theft, like taking, you know what
Mm-hmm.
I mean? And it's like
Playing.
taking,
Yeah.
giving, and that's kind of all of what Mercury is. It's like all of those things. And I think you see so many almost like I don't know if contradictions would be the right word, but we see like play, and then we
Mm-hmm.
see theft, and we
Yeah.
think so many things that like almost would counteract each
Yeah.
other. But because Mercury is so versatile,
Yes.
and Mercury does not see like one side of things, I
Mm-hmm.
think that's why we see
Mm-hmm.
so many things like that within the significations, is because it's Mercury's all about uh, adaptability. And maybe that's not even the best word to tie in this point, but like this why can't it be both? Like being on both
Yes.
sides of the
Yeah.
line, because they truly wanted their Mercury's goal is to just break down the
Yeah.
idea, which means all things have to be
And
explored.
when you're rationalizing things and thinking about things, I mean, you can rationalize both sides of any argument and
Yes.
any thought. So it's like that's why I think the sort of trickster, vibe. It's like, yeah, we're playing and then we're thinking and then,
Well, and
but I
sometimes
might.
I'm tricking myself. You know what I
Right,
mean? Like
right.
sometimes I'm like deceiving myself by breaking it down too much, right?
Yeah,
Like Mercury can get
so
into the,
true.
like it can think and there can be power in thought, obviously, but then there's overthinking,
Mhm.
there's
Like
underthinking.
who are you fooling yourself? Yeah.
Yeah. Like this is, and both, this is where we try to find the middle of the line on each thing. But yeah, it's so interesting. And I love that,
Mhm.
um, that Mercury like allows us the space to explore in that way.
Right.
Um,
Right.
but yeah, I also like that, like, really people talk about the link of like astrology is
Mhm.
all mercurial,
Mhm.
you know?
Yeah.
And so you see astrology associated a lot under that. You also see rumors,
Mhm.
everything that is spread by word of mouth, um, and like digestible in that way
Mhm.
is all going to be broken down, by Mercury.
Yeah.
So,
Which is as far as I know, I keep going back to the rulership, but it's just Gemini and Virgo are so fun to do this with Mercury because
yeah,
they are like they're they're just the exact two like sides blended together.
yeah,
They just work so well. But with Gemini having the fun facts and Virgo being the fast facts, like the trivia side, and then like okay, a debate argument side.
mm,
Gemini spreading the info the way of like through the grapevine and calling out news or even rumors and gossip, while Virgo's the organizer of it, and
yeah,
Gemini might be the instigator of something, or the same way with the spreading the info, and Virgo is the investigator where they're going to be diving into it.
yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, I love that. Another thing on here that I really like was the details and the routines, or like let's even say like routines and habits.
Yeah.
Is I've heard of Mercury to be like the planet of labor,
Mm.
which is interesting because you would think of labor to be maybe something like Mars would have to do with labor,
Mm-hmm.
with like
The more grueling
energy,
and
grueling,
yeah.
yeah. Um, but really it can be the acts of getting up at the same time every morning and
Mm-hmm.
going to work,
Mm-hmm.
and doing all of these things that are kind of set up for us in our life, like this pushing forward all the times, and
Mm.
like the labor that we put into our tasks.
Mm-hmm.
But even think of like service, how service has a
Mm-hmm.
signification is like this, the labor that we put into life,
Yeah.
because Mercury is always like forward.
Yeah.
Mercury, let's say outside of retrograde, is
Totally.
always pushing forward.
Mm-hmm. I
um
mean, it's interesting that you even say that now because it's like, yeah, think about what even fills your day, if not, even if there's sort of a lacking or whatever of your routine or your habit or your labor, and the labor can obviously mean so many things as well.
mhm.
So it really is like, what is our interaction with our day when we wake up looking like,
Yeah,
and how are we moving through
yeah.
it as time goes
Yeah,
by? Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah. Um, So, should we talk about Mercury retrograde?
I actually think it's a great transition right now to Mercury retrograde, because I was talking about the labor stuff,
Yeah.
and something that, okay, so Mercury retrograde is happening about 2 to 3 times a year. This is like huge. Everybody knows what Mercury
Oh
retrograde
no,
is
yeah.
like. The world is
Yeah.
ending. Um, so, um, so first thing, it is like normal
Mhm.
and healthy to note that, like, it is a normal function of Mercury to go into retrograde 2 to 3 times a year. Like that is just a part of Mercury's
Quite
functioning.
literally, right, integrated into how Mercury
Yeah, like that
functions.
is actually just part of what it does. So when we talk about Mercury, it's almost impossible not to talk about retrograde, because, this is a part of like
Of how we
how,
learn.
yes, and that's the biggest thing, is something that I love is, um, like Mercury, talking about the labor part, right? Is that Mercury retrograde pushes us almost out of that routine and gives us an opportunity to learn how to function, how to think, how to communicate, how to act
Mhm.
when there are errors or
Yeah.
dysfunction or
When shit
things
hits
aren't
the
always,
fan, like,
yeah, when things
what are
get
you gonna
really
do?
wacky, yeah, and all of a sudden, like, is this not how we learn in life,
Mhm.
is by the things that we aren't expecting to come up. And so Mercury retrograde almost gives us like a consistent pattern of like, here you go,
Yeah,
like we
remember
are,
this?
yeah.
Yeah.
And someone, I think it was Alice Sparkly Cat, she was like,
Love her, yeah.
yeah, she has like a great read on Mercury retrograde, and I loved it.
Mhm.
But she was really advocating for this idea that like we could benefit from more time in retrograde.
Yeah.
Like we could, like, wouldn't it be nice to be able to like deregulate ourselves a little
Slow
bit?
down and review
Yeah,
and
review. And she was talking about like this idea of grief and how we always like push forward, and
oh,
how it's,
right.
we are always taught to push, and Mercury tells us to go forward, forward, forward. And she had like a quote on her thing that says, um, stop being so productive. Mercury retrograde is saying that Mercury retrograde says, stop being so productive. There are far too many things that you've been meaning to come back to,
Mm.
and like,
Ah, that
yeah.
makes you, like, emotional almost,
I
like
know, because it's like whether it's grief, whether it is just the ability to slow down
Mhm.
and like go to other things, it is this, Mercury is always teaching us something, right? Whether we are going forward or whether we're taking the time to get a little messy for a second, like there's always a lesson in Mercury. And so Mercury retrograde, I think, gives us an opportunity to actually like reflect
Yeah,
on what have I really been learning, or have I just been so ingrained in my routine,
right.
like how much have I actually learned? Let's look.
Yeah, and I think, um, the part of the quote that, like, hits is that, yeah, there's so many things you meant to come back to. When I think about that for myself, it's like, okay, well, when you're having a bad day maybe, or something happened with a in a personal relationship or whatever, just uh something maybe dealing with heart matters even,
Hmm.
and not having to do with your routine and not having to do with the labor and
Yeah,
just, but Mercury is kind of pushing you past that, and sometimes you need to push past that. Sometimes you're in the middle of your workday, it's not time to
have a
go,
breakdown.
yeah, to go cry about
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
And then, like, before you know it, days have passed and it's like, wait, I don't even really remember what was going on. I don't even know if I actually spent any time sitting with that. And I don't know, I think it's kind of, that's it's really, I don't know, it's cool about the retrograde. That's like that the reason that it's feeling like, oh my god, and things are going wrong, these things need your attention. it's
Yeah.
it's really like, a gift. I don't want to sound so extreme, but it really is kind
No,
of a
it
gift,
is.
yeah, in
Yeah.
that way of, let's take this time to,
Yeah,
yeah, revisit.
it is. And I love that. I think it's like a good change of perspective, which is
Yeah.
sometimes the only thing it requires to
Uh-huh.
like be able to take it on the chin a little bit.
Yeah.
Is like, okay, there's something here, and always remembering that like we're dealing with Mercury here. If
Mhm.
Mercury's in retrograde, well, I know what is Mercury's goal. It's to teach me.
Mhm.
I'm meant to be a student and a
Mhm.
teacher and all of
Mhm.
these things. And so it's like, okay, maybe it's my time to be a student and just like
Yeah.
observe and like what's coming up for me now. Why am I so overwhelmed that I, ran out of gas, or that my flight got delayed, or
Yeah.
whatever the little tiny things are that Mercury brings up, is like, why am I letting this dismantle
Yeah,
things for
like,
me,
yeah,
you know
focusing and zooming in so much
yeah,
on it.
looking so much at the thing
Yeah.
instead of maybe like what am I supposed to learn here,
Yeah.
you know
And I think that is, even going back to the trickster thing, I think that's what
mm,
makes me, that's like what's funny and silly about Mercury as a teacher. I think it's cool that Mercury as a teacher is sort of the jokester or trickster in a way, because it's like, like, no, you forgot about this. Let's go back to this.
yeah,
But it's almost like in a, in a compassionate way. Like, no, wait, we're not going to keep just going forward, 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 and forgetting about all these things you left behind. Like, I'm not going to let you do that.
yeah,
We have it 2 to 3 times a year, every year. I mean, and every time it comes, we're like, oh no, Mercury retrograde's here. And it's like, no, this is happening all the
yeah. Like, at
time.
what point do we stop complaining about something that is like such a regular cycle? Like,
Consistent.
it's
Yeah.
not going to stop
No.
happening. So
Yeah.
we might as well like look into it. Like,
Yeah.
what is this calling me to
Sink
see?
in.
And I also am thinking, like, I wonder if Mercury is almost like an assist to Saturn. Do you know what I mean in that way? Like
Yeah.
Saturn is like the slow teacher, where we learn these big lessons about our life, and almost like Mercury. I don't know. I'm just thinking of this, but like that Mercury is maybe like kind of like giving us some experience. Like
Yeah.
it's giving us just the same way Saturn does, but in a more regular and consistent way on a smaller scale. Mercury's like, let me let me give you some little lessons so that
Mhm.
Saturn doesn't completely beat you
Wreck
up.
your, yeah.
Yeah.
And if when I personify them, I know we obviously haven't gotten like into Saturn yet, but if Saturn's kind of like father time, or I think of it as like, old man with a beard. I don't know, would you
Yeah.
kind of the same idea? I feel like, yeah, Mercury could be kind of like the nephew or the son who's like, all right,
Yeah, well,
let's
because we're thinking of this like almost, I mean, Saturn's obviously more of a disciplinary, but Mercury is focused on the smaller details. It helps us, like when we can get into small details, we naturally, it's like when we're studying, it's
mhm.
like we're preparing by looking at like
Mhm.
the small parts,
Mhm.
whereas Saturn is like this big picture, when we can learn to be more disciplined in this way,
Yeah.
right? And focus on what we're really being met with, then the things don't feel so big,
Right. And what's funny is I almost just like we were when talking about, Saturn kind of being the disciplinary.
Mm.
And I was thinking, yeah, and like Mercury is like the brother. And that's literally, brothers and siblings and kind of cousins.
Oh,
They
yeah.
are literally connected to Mercury in that way.
Yeah.
So they're kind of they're not the authoritative disciplinary figure, but they're like, all right, let me give you some guidance, some, brotherly advice
Yeah.
sort of thing. That's at least how I am
For
taking it a little
sure.
bit.
Yeah. Yeah, I always thought it was interesting that Mercury, one of Mercury's like significations is like younger younger brothers.
Mhm.
I always thought that was interesting,
Well, even youth, and I think that is an overlooked age group of um, being somebody to learn from in a way. Like children are playful and they're new and they're figuring things out, and I think there's things to learn from kids too in a way, or things to learn about things to learn from when you think about yourself as a child and what
Yeah, and
how
how to
you
take in
learn things
information
exactly.
and then same thing on the flip side where like that is such an prime age of taking in information and
Totally.
trying to make sense of it.
Yeah.
um
Yeah.
yeah, I love that. um okay, so now moving into Mercury and how it kind of communicates, or let's say how other planets kind of communicate through
Mhm.
it.
Mhm.
So Mercury is really like the intermediary, or oh my gosh, the intermediary
Yeah.
between the sun and the rest of the planets. So the sun is going to funnel through
Mhm.
Mercury to give the message
Mhm.
to everybody else. Okay. Well, my sun is and Mercury
We
are the
all
same sign and yours too. So um but Mercury is essentially, whether yours are in the same sign or not, is going to like convey the general idea of the sun,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And like the concept of what your sun is about and
Mhm.
what it believes and
Mhm.
what it strives to be. So
Mhm.
much of what we talked about when we talked about the sun, Mercury kind of becomes its like spokesperson,
Right.
so oftentimes when you do have the sun and Mercury in the same sign, that message can be very clear because you
Mhm.
are almost filtering, well, you are filtering through that same um, like channel. You're
Mhm.
filtering through the same
Mhm.
channel. Um,
They're on the
and
same page, I guess,
yeah,
right?
like
Yeah.
it's easy for one to understand the other and
Mhm.
to put it into words and to let it out
Yeah.
because it's almost like it's just like click, click, click. But when, say, your Mercury is in a sign outside of your sun, oftentimes it can maybe be harder to get to know the person right off the bat because you may hear the words from the Mercury, right?
Mhm.
Um, like people that I know, oftentimes if someone asks me, say, to like guess their sign and say, I guess their Mercury,
Yeah.
like if
Yeah.
we had just been in conversation and I guess their Mercury sign, well, that's really all I'm getting from them in the moment, and their ascendant, I'm
Mhm.
sure, but the sun, the idea of the sun may be different if the signs
Mhm.
are different. And so oftentimes when you get to know that person a little bit better is when you kind of see,
Mhm.
I think, that Mercury start to melt a little bit more. It's kind of like what we talked about with the ascendant, but different, and maybe can show up in different environments, right? Like when I maybe, especially if like I'm being of service or something like
Right.
that, I may often see someone's Mercury be a very prevalent
Part of,
force.
right.
Yeah, um, because they're thinking and they're organizing and they're putting
Mhm.
things together, right?
Mhm.
So that Mercury is like really at play, but I may not understand them or their motive or where their
Mhm.
heart is, right?
Mhm.
Like that idea of the sun. And so as I get to know them better, I'm like, oh, like I'll start to understand how those two things kind of work together, but it
Mhm.
may not happen right off the bat.
Mhm. Which is interesting because how we were talking about at the start, where your Mercury can only be one sign away from what your sun sign
Mm-hmm.
is. It it's I don't know if it's like luckily or if it's just that's how that would function regardless. But I mean, imagine having, if that weren't the case, your sun, like for example, for me, sun in Libra, but then my Mercury was in like um, Gemini or Aries or something. I feel like the signs closer to Libra being Virgo or Scorpio,
So you're saying like if,
they would have an easier time almost, even though they're still not the same sign. It can kind of like those the signs that are right next to each other sort of have similar themes flowing into one another.
I do, yeah, I do believe that. I do believe that like each sign is kind of learning a lesson from the last one,
Right.
you
And
know.
so if it wasn't the case that Mercury, if it could be any other sign, I could see how that would probably cause even more issues with the sun, of like you are coming up very differently
Right.
than what is at the core of, your heart or your
Yeah.
goals. And
Yeah,
yeah.
I completely agree. Um, yeah, it's just cool. It's interesting how at different areas of being, right? Like whether I am at work
Mhm.
or whether I am being of service somewhere
Mhm.
or whether I'm at home, like
Mhm.
this, talking to someone I'm very close to, like we will show different areas of our chart,
Mhm.
you know.
Mhm.
I found that to be really, really true.
Mhm.
Um, and I can often guess a sign in someone's chart,
Mhm.
you
Yeah,
know.
it's there. Yeah.
It's there. I mean, I know it's in there somewhere, but I'm not going to guess which one it is,
Yeah.
like I don't. It's very interesting. So, um, yeah, I would say that's a huge one, is the Mercury and Sun
Mhm.
together, because Mercury is going to be that filter mainly for the Sun to convey its ideas to the rest of the planets,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Um, so, but then there are obviously ways that that Mercury interacts with other planets as
Right.
well. Um, did you want to talk about any of like Venus, Mars, any of those
Yeah.
planets?
Well, do you want to mention the moon one? Because I know that was something more specific that you had, um, with the moon. How the moon doesn't have retrograde.
Yeah, I mean, we were kind of past like the retrograde stuff,
Oh, that's
but
true.
I can bring it up as just that in relation to, like, we're talking about Mercury retrograde, and obviously there are other planets that have retrograde. Moon does not.
Mhm.
Moon does not have retrograde cycles. Um, so there's still some stability to lunar
Mhm.
cycles. I think it's just kind of a fun fact. And then ancients saw that which was more stable as more divine.
Yeah.
Um, but really, okay, I like that,
Yeah.
but I also like what we got into about, because I what I don't want to do is like keep pushing forward this idea that Mercury retrograde is less divine,
Yeah.
but I do always like to hear like the angel. I mean, most of what I take in and really
Mhm.
resonate with
Yeah.
is
Well, I know
ancient
this is a little bit
astrology.
off, but if anything, I think that makes me think about how when we were talking about the luminaries, how
Mhm.
sometimes even in ancient astrology, um, the moon was sort of their guide, and the fact that it has that stability and,
Yeah,
um, I don't know, could and it feels more divine, is, um, that luminary they pull to maybe sooner than we do with the
yeah.
sun. But yeah.
And obviously the ancients were very like biased towards the
Yeah.
moon, which, but I totally
Yeah, as
relate
are
to that
you.
in my
Yeah.
heart, and so I get it. Like they're like, everything about this guy is divine. Like
Yeah.
we got
He doesn't
nothing
go
but
into retrograde?
yeah, check, check,
Yeah.
check. Like they will hype that guy up all the way.
Yeah.
But the moon to them was really arguably more important than
Yeah.
the sun,
Mhm.
and they talk, a lot about it, and so ancient astrologers at least, and so yeah, it's always fun to see kind of their ideas in comparison, um, and then talking about the stability and the divinity that ties into that. I just thought it was a fun fact, but
Yeah. I do like that.
yeah.
Um, well, I guess with Beyond the Moon, with Mercury and Venus, um, Mercury and Venus being conjunct or being in the same sign, um, or I guess Mercury and Venus combinations can sort of display like words as a form of art.
Yeah, I like the combinations, right? Is like, because yes, like Mercury and Venus together.
Regardless, it's words as a form of art.
Yeah, and it's not that, yeah, and it's more so, how are your words a form of
Right.
art, because it's like, yes, of course, I think people have an idea over what is more like artistic than,
Yeah.
not,
What
and
even is art? I mean, that's such a subjective.
yes, okay, period, yes, but also, like, I don't know, there's this, I think, idea that words as a form of art are gentle and they're soft and they're, you know
Oh,
what I mean?
totally. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, but, that is subjective, right?
Mhm.
And so, how do my Mercury and Venus combine, and what does that look like for me? But I guess more so is that, um, will be more like a wordy,
Mhm.
like, how can I use my words? And we think of Venus and we think of relations,
Mhm. Mhm.
and then my Mercury is like, how am I going to communicate that? So those things work together to like put me almost into that partnership. And I don't just mean like intimacy, I just mean relational in general, is
Mhm.
like, how am I connecting myself with the people? And I'm
Mhm.
doing that outwardly,
Mhm. Mhm.
versus Mars, which obviously would be, we talk about Mercury and Mars, and like the idea of like mental focus and things like that. And I think you'll see that more with more like concentrated energies in those placements together,
Yeah.
to have like a great mental focus.
Right.
But
Right.
it will absolutely signify your mental focus, period,
Yeah.
whether it's great and strong or not,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. That
Um,
makes sense too.
but yeah.
And speaking of Mercury and Mars, I think when we compare them together side by side, obviously, as we've been talking about Mercury, I mean, there's so many things to list at this point, but some of the communication intelligence, like learning keywords, um, I think for Mercury, there's a lot of the teaching, the learning, and problem solving through interaction with the environment and kind of developing these skills through observation and through pattern repeating and tactile, whatever it is. Where Mars um, can show your natural strengths, that natural energy, that natural driving force that you might have already, that you're not necessarily like sharpening, or looking through
It's more of a
observation.
raw energy.
Right.
Like
It's
Mars
not.
is literally
Yeah.
energy. And so therefore it's something that's like fizzling inside of us.
It's
Like
not this
it's,
like, oh, pattern recognition and now I'm going to
mhm,
copy it. It's
yeah,
already there.
yeah.
But it can also display, I think, maybe your type of intelligence as far as like a learning style, or maybe having an emotional intelligence, or having physical, intelligence or skill, I guess, in that way. And then also we talked too about Mercury and Mars, or as Mercury's sifting and judging and organizing their thoughts and collecting the information, and Mars comes in and makes the decision at that point and puts the action forward to push forward.
Yeah, like Mercury becomes that, like, and it will, I'll say, remains that like ball of energy that is going to like propel us, or like tell us maybe how, like you had mentioned, how we're going to do it.
Right. Right.
Um, and Mercury will also do that. And I would like to talk about that a little bit more. Like Mercury will, obviously, we've talked so much so about the planet of Mercury, and I think that's really important, is to understand like what Mercury's functions are. But okay, and then what does it mean to have those functions in a sign? You
True.
know,
Yeah. In your
and so
chart. Yeah.
yeah, and so Mercury really does have a function that way. But Mars is going to tell me like, you know, am I going to push forward with, you know, I mean, for me, am I going to emotionally push forward, with my Mars is in Cancer,
Hmm.
am I going to do this out of emotionalism? Like, what kind of that knee jerk into
Hmm.
Mercury,
Hmm.
and Mars will give us that into anything. But
The impulse.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, versus like maybe Mars and Capricorn that would maybe have a more structured approach that would maybe match
Right.
better into Mercury's energy.
Right.
Um,
Yep.
but yeah, I like that. Um, so something I guess we can talk about um, that might be a good way to like tie all of this together
Mhm.
is exploring a little bit about um, what these signs look like in Mercury. And
Mhm.
obviously, we don't need to walk through every single one, but just
Mhm.
some like ideas. Like we can start with some things we've already touched on, but to kind of draw it back to this point and make it clear that, excuse me, that these planets do take on energy. Like this
Mhm.
planet does take on an energy. So let's use Virgo as an example. We talked about Mercury taking things apart and putting it back together, but that's
Mhm.
really just like a really good um, Virgo example of Mercury.
Totally.
Like
Totally.
Virgo Mercury is so good at breaking it all apart and putting it all together.
Would you say that's the case for just Virgo in general, or specifically a Virgo and Mercury placement? Or are we kind of just talking about the energies in
No, I'm
general?
talking about Virgo and Mercury. I think Virgos can. Um, I think Virgos
Tend
can.
to do that.
Yeah, I think that that's definitely like a trait of theirs, but maybe not in this way or to
Hmm.
this degree.
The
And yeah,
meticulousness, and the maybe the urge to.
yeah, and I think I would also challenge um, I would challenge like the thought of like looking at the Virgos charts that do behave that way. Do they also have a Virgo Mercury? And
Yeah.
since
Yeah.
those, you know what I
So
mean?
true.
Because I know some people in my life who have Virgo placements, and like, because I'm thinking of people off the top of my head, okay, I know some Virgos who maybe don't do that, right?
Hmm.
Which can be for a plethora of reasons.
Hmm.
But a few in my head right now are ones with like Leo Mercuries,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
so it's interesting because it's the process is going to be a lot different
Hmm.
when you have a Leo Mercury. Um, so yeah, that would be an interesting observation to make. Um, but then I think of Leo
Hmm.
Mercury. Um, yeah.
Well, I know that um, we kind of talked about this with you, where it feels like you go into things and you want to go step by step, but it just doesn't end up being that way, and you feel kind of more comfortable jumping into
Yeah.
where you feel pulled to, and
Yeah.
kind of spreading out that way instead of starting at like bullet point one.
Yeah. Like anytime I'm around um, my earthy friends, or like, especially if they have Mercury in Virgo
Mhm.
or like Mars in Capricorn
Mhm.
or something like that, will audibly, like, just, I will say, like, I wish that I could.
Mhm.
I wish that I could, like, that would be a way for me to level up. You know what
Mhm.
I mean? If I could just break shit down that way.
Mhm.
And it's just not. Now, while I can really do that to some level, right?
Mhm.
Like, I think in a lot of areas of my life, I'm very like, I like to break it down and have it
Mhm.
organized.
Mhm.
But I just can never convey my thoughts outwardly, like outside of my brain and my
Mhm.
body, into what I'm trying to say.
Mhm.
Um, and I take in their information really well. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? It's not like I can't really
You can,
absorb it in that
yeah.
way, but I can't create it. I just
Mhm.
can't. And
Mhm.
it also reminds me of like Virgos and writing things down and being like instructional, and
Mhm.
like Virgo Mercury.
Mhm.
And I finally was like, okay, that's just not me.
Yeah.
That's just not me. And so, yeah, absolutely true. Like, I started to really look around and be like, well, how do I learn best?
Mhm.
And how do I tend to participate when it comes to that? And it's usually um, exactly what you said.
Mhm.
Like, I am good at being thrown into everything at once.
Mhm.
Um, and when I'm in a conversation, like, I will cling on to something, or when I'm learning something, like, let's use astrology, for
Mhm.
example. I'll be going down a rabbit hole. I'll find something that I love, and then I'm like, scratch all that, and then I'm down
Yeah,
here, and then
totally.
I'm over here. And at this point, I've learned bits and pieces of 20 different things, but it takes me longer, maybe, maybe,
Maybe, yeah.
but or it's just a different process, but I'm able, all of a sudden there's like this whole picture created, and I put it all together. So sometimes I get to the same point, but I guess I just take a different angle, and
An
so it's interesting.
analogy I could just now from talking about
Yeah,
it, because I obviously know you, so I know exactly what you're talking about,
yeah.
because I think you get pulled into a conversation where your heart or your passion kind of like jumps in. Not that everything can be interesting to you, but it's like, oh, that I'm gonna attack that, and then we'll work our way from there. But I
Mm-hmm.
think about, like, let's say, an artist is drawing something and it's like the Virgo way, or the Mercury way even would be, or sorry, mercurial way,
Mm-hmm.
would be, okay, let's start the lines of the sketch of like the outer face and like the shadows, and then like maybe like Leo Mercury gets in there and they're like, my favorite part is to draw the eyes, so I'm going to start drawing the eyes, and then we'll work our way out.
Yeah,
At the end, it's still the same thing,
yeah,
but it's just how you kind of navigate how
yeah,
you want to do it,
yeah,
and what makes it fun and what
yeah,
makes sense. Yeah.
yeah. That feels good to me.
Yeah.
And I just can't. As soon as I'm done with something, I'm like, it's done.
Yeah.
And I will come back,
Mhm.
but I'll probably find it in a new way that I
Mhm.
feel passionate about. And that is that fire, Leo, like passion. Like I need to feel like my heart is there. And then when it's
Mhm.
not, I need to go somewhere else and then I'll
Mhm.
come back.
Mhm.
So how would you say it shows up for like Libra?
Oh, I have been sitting here thinking about that while I'm also listening to you. I'm like,
You're like, well, I swear I'm listening to you. I've totally been trying to think about what mine does.
it's just, and this is why we laugh about it, because we're like, okay, our big three, and we have these like, you know, oh, we have double the signs, and then we move to our Mercury, and it's like, okay, and we're both also conjunct with our Sun and Mercury. So sometimes, when we've talked about this last time too, when I was talking about the rising and the moon, where I'm like, what comes from what, and we can sit here and break this whole thing down right now, but I think my Mercury being in Libra, I don't know, it's just, I guess it's just something that, I don't know, because I feel like when I think about, I feel like there's something there with, I like to try to relate. I have to
Mm-hmm.
be able to relate to other things. I want to relate to other things to understand them. I do that with people. Like, what can I find in common? And I know that is a normal way of interacting with people or
Yeah.
engaging with people, but like almost like mirroring, like what can I see um, in you that I also have myself, or vice versa, and like kind of moving that way. Um, I think, yeah, I mean, I just, I don't want to go into the like maybe stereotypical, or I don't know, easy of like Libras, and they just like the poetry and the music, and it's all like whatever, because obviously there's a lot of fire in my chart. So even though I do maybe relate to some of that sort of softer energy, it's just, it seems like too easy maybe to just jump to that. As far as like comparing to how you talk about like learning and jumping in, that's where I'm thinking of like, I don't know, I do feel like maybe I'm a little bit, I don't know, a little structured in that way, I guess.
Okay.
I don't know, what, I feel like you have some thoughts, so.
No, I hadn't. I was honestly interested, and I was trying to think of like what Libra Mercuries do I know, and I'm sure, considering the amount of Libras that I have in my life, that there are many,
Mhm.
but none that are coming to the top of my mind. And you know, I hate to go into like the generic themes of Libra
All
and stuff
right.
because that's not fun, you know. However, I do see like when you problem solve and things like that, is you can be very diplomatic, you know,
Mhm.
and like you have this natural, um, almost like desire, and I mean, maybe not even a desire, right? Because a desire would almost be conscious,
Mhm.
like this inclination to like be of service to
Mhm.
people,
Mhm.
you know, is like, how can I help make this better, you
Mhm.
know, like
Mhm.
how can we find something that works. So I don't know, and it's interesting because we want to think about Mercury as a planet on its own versus how it works with your other planets,
Right.
because you
Right.
obviously have a lot of Aries, Sagittarius, like you
Mhm.
have these fiery signs in your chart that may almost contradict that. But
Mhm.
if we're talking about how does Mercury show
Totally,
up,
yeah.
then it is going to probably be a
I
lot of
mean,
those things.
yeah, I would say, and I mean, we're at this point, we're talking about personality traits that sure, like anybody can have, but and as a Libra, they're true regardless. But I would say, like, in communication or in even my thinking, I would say I can be diplomatic in that way. And also, like, as we were talking about, sort of that over
Yeah.
rationalizing, um, that Mercury can do, where
Yeah.
they can out rationalize their feelings. I mean, I think that's definitely something that I can think of for myself, where, I'll have a feeling sitting in, sitting inside me, but then I'm just always thinking, well, like, they probably think that this, and if it's any conflict, or and that can be helpful sometimes, and that can also be, a disservice to myself. So it's just, I do think there's that sort of, um, when do I stop, like, trying to see other perspective and coming back into
Interesting.
my own,
Yeah.
maybe.
Yeah.
um
I was, as you're saying that, um, to quote you, I was listening and also
yeah, thinking.
thinking at the same time.
Right.
And I went to Alice Barkley Cat because I was curious, because she
Hmm.
always, but she gets wordy in the best way
In the
possible.
best way, she's
Yeah,
great.
but it's hard to also multitask. But I picked a sentence, and you were pretty much saying what it was.
Okay, that makes me feel better that I kind of
Yeah.
know what I'm saying.
So it says Mercury in Libra doesn't shy away from conflict, as is popularly believed. You'll sometimes look around and find that there is much conflict caused by them. However, they won't escalate a conflict that is also pointless. Here's the point: they're slow on deciding how to engage and how to avoid. They inch around, rationalizing gut feelings and empathy into contradicting degrees of right or wrong.
Yeah.
Then they'll make their judgment.
Yeah.
It'll be a judgment that moves the group along.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so it is. It's almost like, that almost sounds a little Aquarian to me. You know what
Mhm.
I mean? It's like taking all of the things in
Yeah.
and waiting to find like a balanced version of the truth.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah,
And
I
I
like
think
that.
that's where you might see some of the, even more so than, like, maybe Sun. I think a Mercury in Libra can show that sort of stereotypical indecisiveness, and it's because while you're thinking about things, you want to make sure you are making the right decision. Like, there has to be a correct one.
Yeah.
And it's not like a matter of, like, gut, or oh, I brought all the facts together, this is the facts, it's straightforward, this is what we're going to do. It's like, well, okay, but, like, what about, like, you know these other facts? It's like,
Yeah.
it can be. I don't think, it has to be this way, but for me, it can be that sort of, like, when do I stop, um,
Rationalizing.
rationalizing and the overthinking and the
When do
rumination of
I
it?
stop being so mercurial?
Right. Yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
a great
Yeah.
example of how Mercury can like take us down that road of like, and Libra is a great example of it, because
As an air
Libra,
sign.
yeah, as an air sign, and as like really, like, I hate to say the peacekeeper of the zodiac, but when I say that, I was like, we've talked before ourselves about how Libra can be, almost learns how to behave as like, I know that this is going to keep me safe and away from whatever the hell those people are
Mhm.
dealing with over
Mhm.
there. Is
Mhm.
like, so really learns to like study people.
Mhm.
Um, and so naturally, I can rationalize myself into all different sides of things to try to like, I don't know, get to a common goal. But yeah, and I'm sure there's so much more
Yeah.
to that. But
Yeah.
I'm interested.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if you had like thoughts on that, but I'm glad that we could kind of like answer it together a little
I
bit.
think I've always had. It's like how we said again at the beginning, where it's like this. Mercury is about your thinking and your communication, and it's like, on paper, I immediately can understand my Libra and Mercury in that sense. As we, like, bring in all of this other personality to Mercury, and all of these other, like, areas and relationships
Mm-hmm.
and, functioning, it's like that's when I start to feel like, what is my Libra and Mercury doing? You know what I mean? That's when it
Yeah.
starts to feel, yeah, I did have to think about it for a little
Yeah.
bit.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, because there's so many. Well, and two, like Mercury is adaptable, as is Libra,
uh-huh.
and Mercury
Mhm.
sees all sides of things. But
Mhm.
I mean, that, yeah, like we said, it could just take us down either
Yeah,
road.
yeah.
So
Yeah.
I don't know. It's fun. It's fun to talk about all the different ways that Mercury can kind of enter into our lives. And like, well, yes, it is very much so. I think we've really like honed in on a lot of like the critical thinking and the breaking things down. And but I don't want to forget like the, I'll say like the Gemini to it. You
The
know what I mean? Like
play.
the play, like the,
And that's
yes,
not
like
to
the,
say Gemini doesn't also have that critical thinking in that way. It's
totally.
just that it is, they they're meeting here, and then it just veers off,
Yeah,
you
like
know?
Mercury is also like what I think I saw somewhere, and I really liked this, is like stand-up comedy. You know
Yeah.
what I mean?
Mhm.
Like being able to be like, it's quick-witted,
Mhm.
but not that stand-up comedy can't also, like it is often, if not more often,
Like
like
long form.
planned
Oh,
out. Do
yeah,
you know what I
yeah,
mean?
yeah.
Like people know what they're going to say when they go up there, but it is the art of telling jokes,
It's not
you
recorded,
know?
you're getting up there, and it's you're in and you're interacting with the room. You know what I
Yes.
mean? They have to receive you, and you have to receive them, and it's like you can only be so scripted until
Yeah.
you have to like navigate. And that's what's cool about, when you think about Gemini too, is like the Gemini being the chameleon, and that they're going to find that flow, they're going to find that rhythm
Yeah.
regardless. And
Like being able to be dynamic
right.
and show a bunch of different forms and lean into dis what can maybe be discomfort of like through this. I mean, it's like it is a form of critical thinking. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? Like
Mhm.
how am I going to solve whatever problem may come up, and it is that constant, like Mercury can be fun and it can be lively and it can be playful and it can, I mean, Mercury is art. Mercury is written art.
Mhm.
It is verbal art. Anything that is required, like to write,
Mhm.
speak, anything like that. That's why we have the writers, poets, all, well, poets, writers. No, no comment.
But,
But
spoken word
yeah, I
poetry.
was thinking that's what I was
Yeah, yeah,
thinking.
yeah.
Okay. Um, but yeah, like these are all, and stand-up comedy,
Mhm.
like they're all different forms of, some can be serious and sober, and some can be, you know, belligerent
Yeah.
and fun and exciting, and then they can be all of those things at
Well,
once.
I
So
have like a thought about the comedy thing, which I think is so interesting because it's working so well for what you just said about the stand-up
mhm.
comedy. And is that when you think about, I promise I'm not going to go too far off on a tangent, but when you think about like the origins of where stand-up comedy started in comedy, I mean, sorry for my lack of like word usage, but in medieval times, and far back in history, comedians were like out there on standing on a little cement block, or and just it was all satire and criticizing of the politics of the monarchy or whatever. And it wasn't like a, okay, I'm setting up my joke and here's the joke. It was, you know again, spreading the
Like a
information, and the
protest almost.
kind of like a gossip, like a
Oh,
news
okay.
almost,
Yeah, yeah.
like, haha, we're making fun of like the
Yeah.
queen and what she
Yeah,
did,
yeah.
but it's a joke, you
Yeah.
can't, it's art, but
Yeah.
like this is our avenue of like how we're going to criticize or like spread information
Mhm.
through this avenue of
Yeah,
play, and so
totally.
that's where it's cool how that the comedy part comes in of, well, there is that sort of judgment as well, and that criticizing of
Yeah.
whatever it is, and that wit, and
Yeah.
being able to like be sneaky about how you're saying what
Yes.
you're saying, and
Yeah.
no, it's not, I didn't mean it like
Yeah.
that, so
Especially like today, like having to, like, I don't know, you have to be very mindful, and like you're always, I don't know, I feel like people with comedy, you're always having to tread the line of going too far.
yeah.
You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Always.
Mhm.
And so there's so much, there is like a skill that is
Yeah.
required for that,
That are, they like go under the radar
Yeah,
of like,
like that
oh, that was
slyness of
really
like,
bad, but it was hilarious, so
yeah,
you're good. Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
Yeah. Like
Yeah.
we were this close. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think Mercury really, like, again, it straddles that line,
Mhm.
and um it doesn't really, Mercury tries not to like keep too hard of terms on either side of an
Yeah.
idea.
Yeah.
Like it is open and flowing and like constantly taking in
Mhm.
more
Mhm.
and exploring different ways. Um
Willing to change, willing to learn.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. For sure. Like that idea of like discernment and things,
Mhm.
like it is constantly using that as a factor as well. So um yeah, I don't know. There's a million more things that we could probably go into about this, but I think that is a good point
Yeah.
to wrap it up.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, next week we
Mhm.
will talk about Venus,
Mhm.
which would be fun. I feel like we've like touched probably on Venus and like all
I'm
of these.
sure. I know
Yeah,
I was.
yeah,
Yeah.
we've like tied it in, so it'll be fun to kind of go headfirst into that. And then we'll talk about Mars in the following episode. So it'll be
Yeah.
fun to bounce from one to the next and see kind of like the contrasting bits between
Yeah.
them.
We're going to get into the personalities of them.
Yeah, like well, once we start moving into Venus and Mars, but like especially Venus, it's more of like this. It's like this specific area of life. You know what I
Yeah. Yeah.
mean? Like
Yeah.
I, I am often talking about my Venus sign, and one of my first things that I talked about in our first episode was how like this stark difference between myself in friendships versus in
Mm-hmm.
relationships, like intimate relationships, and why that was like my uh like identity crisis that I had
Mm-hmm.
was
Your
like,
entry into
what,
diving in. Yeah.
who is this person? Like
Yeah.
this is not a person that I recognize.
Yeah.
And so my Venus placement opened that door,
Mm-hmm.
you know. So it'll be interesting to, and yours too,
Yeah.
yours
Oh,
being and ours being so different. So we'll finally be out of all of
we're
our
not going to be
Libra
talking
and
about,
Leo.
yeah. And yeah. Yeah.
So it'll be fun to have some different conversations.
Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure.
But
So
anyways, yeah. Thanks for listening. And we will
see you next time.
talk to you guys in a few weeks. Bye.